The Rocky Mountains are draped in a carpet of evergreens, an expansive refuge for caribou, wolves, and bison. Survival in this forest world means maintaining a delicate balance between growth and destruction, death and rebirth. Jasper National Park in Canada, an inferno rages through the forest. With flames reaching 196 feet high, spreading over 300 acres. These trees don't stand a chance. But that's all part of the plan. This fire was deliberately set. A forest should be in a constant state of regeneration. When trees get too tall, they block all the sunlight from hitting the ground. This stops smaller plants from growing, which means grazing animals can't feed. Mother Nature needs to get rid of these old trees somehow. Often, that's through fire.
The fact is over the last 100 years or so, man has become really good at putting fires out. And what we've done is we've created a situation where we now have too much old-growth forest. What we need to have that mosaic where we have a nice stand of old forest next to a stand of young forest and have all the different tiers in between. That is when you have a healthy forest. What we're trying to do with prescribed burns is we're trying to emulate Mother Nature. In other words, we're trying to put fire back on the landscape.
Dave Smith's job is to start and control these fires.
In the case like this, where we did a prescribed fire, we use an aerial ignition device. It's a machine that sits on a helicopter, and there's balls such as these, and what happens is they're injected with a little bit of glycol before they're dropped onto the ground. And hopefully, we will see what happens.
The glycol bombs combust in a matter of seconds, kick-starting the fire, which Dave and his team then monitor and control.
We have 4 balls here, but a helicopter will be dropping 2 to 3 balls a second as it flies along an ignition path.
Once the large fire starts, the crew goes to its edge to control it with more precise surgical burns.
This is a drip torch. This is the hand drip torch. This is one of the tools we use probably most often for when we're surgically burning or when we're doing cleanup work, because you're basically right next to the fire that you're lighting. So basically what this is it's a gasoline and diesel mixture, and what happens is, this is a wick, it lights on fire, and basically what we can do is walk along and light whatever we want to light.
After several days, the fire slowly withers away, leaving a charred forest behind. Almost immediately, regeneration begins.
So we're here in the middle of the Jack-Ladder prescribed burn, which we undertook just about a week ago. Our objective is to burn, but not burn deep. When you burn deep, that's when you lose your soil, your organic layers, and of course all of your seeds and rhizome or root areas where the grass and other vegetation comes from.
Some tree species, like the jack pine, depend on fire to regenerate. Their pine cones are filled with resin, which melts in a fire to release the seeds. With the old trees gone and sunlight reaching the soil, there's plenty of room for new growth, which means plenty of food for the local grazers. But regeneration isn't always the only goal.
This should have been, historically, it was open grassland, an area where elk, wolves, coyotes, and other wildlife were in abundance in the valley bottom. The reason that we burned here is we want to recreate or bring it back to those open grasslands that once existed here. Fire-weakened trees are something that we worry about from a firefighter point of view. If they fall over, they can hurt somebody. But from a prescribed fire point of view, it's something we really like to see. The fire-weakened tree down here will weaken the tree to the point where wind will easily blow it over. When the trees blow over, we get one step closer to having that open grassland we're looking for. Here's another fire-weakened tree right here, much smaller of course, but something that'll just show you how easy it takes for the wind to blow that over.
A healthy forest is crucial to the ecosystems of the Rocky Mountains. These forests are some of the best habitat for flora and fauna. It's home to an incredible diversity of life because of its milder climates and a huge source of food. The forest is a dynamic ecosystem. It's more than just the tree canopy. It's the shrubbery and the lower vegetation, and the mosses and grasses along the forest floor. On the mountains themselves, this expanse is called a montane forest system. Outside of the mountains and on the outer slopes of the Rockies, these forests are collectively called the boreal forest. Named after Boreas, the Greek god of the north wind, it's dominated by massive coniferous forests of pines, spruces, and larches. The boreal forest stretches across Canada, covering over 60% of the country's land area. It doesn't stop there. This band of trees circles the planet's entire northern hemisphere, interrupted only by water for 600 miles north of the 50th parallel. An endless blanket of evergreens. The trees of these northern forests are perfectly adapted to life in the Rockies. Needles are packed onto each branch, helping to shield the trees from wind and ice. They're covered in a waxy coating to help hold on to as much water as possible. The trees don't drop their needles in the wintertime, so they can photosynthesize all year long, absorbing nutrients and saving energy so the tree can survive when it's minus 40 degrees. Because these trees can provide shelter year-round, they're permanent homes to more than 150 species of birds, more than 85 species of mammals.
There's more trees there than anywhere else on the earth, and it is one of the most important sinks for all the carbon that's in our atmosphere. It takes that carbon and helps to create new forests, and in turn, it creates oxygen for us to breathe.
The forest must be in balance to thrive. As it stretches to the north, it becomes one of the few places left in North America that's undeveloped enough and large enough to support a diverse ecosystem without interference from humans. That means animals here can thrive, like bison, moose, and wolves. It's also home to several species that are facing extinction elsewhere, like caribou and bull trout. As development and tourism grows in the south, this wide expanse of forest is still mostly an ecosystem unchanged. But this forest is also out of balance.
Mother Nature has Plan A, Plan B, and Plan C, and probably further down the alphabet as well. But what we see with mountain pine beetle is its Plan B. Plan A for Mother Nature would be a continuous fires throughout the region, creating that mosaic. Because that's not happening, mountain pine beetle has had a chance to take hold.
Pine beetles are a natural occurrence in the forests of Jasper National Park. These tiny insects have a job to do. Much like fire, their role in the ecosystem is to kill old-growth trees to make way for new growth. Every winter, the pine beetles are killed off to start the cycle again in spring. But temperatures need to be at minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit for several straight days to kill off the beetle. In recent years, temperatures have rarely sunk that low. With humans putting out wildfires, there's a massive amount of fuel to feed hungry pine beetles. More food means more reproducing, which means pine beetle populations are exploding, and the forest is suffering.
Now here's an example of a pine tree that's been hit by pine beetle last year. We can tell by these pitch tubes that are here. If we peel back the bark, I bet you we can find some beetle. As a matter of fact, we can. What we're seeing here is a mountain pine beetle in one of its last stages of development before it turns into an adult. The next step from here is it'll pupate, and then it becomes an adult. In July, these larvae will mature into adult beetles. All at the same time, these beetles will leave the tree and go into attack new trees. And so goes the process of slowly killing this forest by the mountain pine beetle attack.
Pine beetle-infected trees turn red a year after infection. In the skies over Jasper National Park, it's easy to see where the beetles have taken hold. 2 years after infection, the tree is completely dead. Younger trees can fight the infestation, pushing the beetles out with toxic resin, leaving these pitch tubes visible on the outside of the bark. But now, this Plan B is out of control.
We have old forests because we've been putting all our fires out, and we have warmer winters. It's a perfect combination to create the infestations that we're seeing today throughout Western Canada and the United States.
With populations growing into the trillions, these insects are wiping out more of the forest than ever before. Even the younger trees are now succumbing. When they have hundreds of insects trying to dig deep, even the strongest tree can't stay standing. 70,000 square miles of forest, an area half the size of Germany, has already been destroyed in this region. Now, these pesky rice-sized insects are crossing the Rockies and heading east for the first time. To stop them, the parks are bringing back Mother Nature's Plan A.
Fire does a couple of things. One, if it's out in front of the beetle, it will destroy the habitat where the beetle would want to go next. Secondly, what the fire will also do is it will create a younger forest.
Dave is confident that this is a winnable fight.
There's some trouble in the forest right now, and again, a lot of it has to do with the way we've managed the forest by putting forest fires out. But things are changing.
This is the Sawback region of Banff National Park, just south of Jasper. This is the site of one of the first ever prescribed burns, started in 1985, and then burned again in 1993, 1998, and 2014. A new ecosystem has sprung up in their wake.
It's wonderful to go into a newly burned area because the biodiversity is fantastic. There's hundreds of species of animals, insects, vegetation species that we just don't see in an old forest.
Elk and other grazers flood the charred remains after a fire to eat new growth popping through the ashes. Wildfires aren't a huge cause of elk mortality. In fact, it's the opposite. Elk are a fire-dependent species, with their populations rising in the years after a fire. They will run when the fire itself is blazing, but they don't go far. Elk have been spotted feeding just 250 feet from where flames are still burning. Elk also need a healthy forest for more than just food. When cows give birth in the spring, they hide out in the woods for several weeks with their young. They tuck behind shrubbery, surrounded by new growth stands that are just barely taller than the young elk to keep them hidden from predators. The young calves don't emit a scent or even make a noise for the first few weeks of life. Without the new growth after a fire, they would have no place to hide during those dangerous early moments of life. Further north, this female moose is going for a swim in another healthy section of forest. Like elk, moose thrive in the mixed ecosystem that develops after a fire. This particular moose is snacking on seagrasses growing on the bottom of the lake. About half of a moose's diet is from aquatic plants. Unlike elk or deer, moose can close their nostrils so they can stay underwater for up to 30 seconds. As the day gives way to twilight, more moose join the party. Moose are typically solitary animals, but this lake is prime real estate. Bulls never congregate this close to each other without a massive territorial scuffle. There's only one bull here. The rest are cows and their young. So they set aside their private ways in favor of a good meal. Two cows hop in, and a yearling calf follows close by. In the years following a forest fire, moose populations explode. When there's a surplus of new growth, the ecosystem can handle more mouths to feed. Cows will give birth to more twins and triplets than when there isn't a forest fire. Moose don't actually eat much of the old pine trees. They move around, following forest fires, eating the low-lying shrubs, grasses, and flowers that are first to pop up. And so, moose thrive among the ashes, which is good news, as they need all the help they can get. Since the late 20th century, moose populations have been in steady declines across North America. Habitat loss and a vicious breed of winter tick have taken a steady toll. In some areas of the Rockies, moose populations are down 35%. And some regions of British Columbia are reporting declines of almost 70%. But in this pocket of northern forest, populations are stable and even growing thanks to its preserved habitat. Today, there are more moose in the northern stretch of the Rockies than there are American bison. But this land used to be bison territory. 30 million bison once roamed this part of Canada, keeping the forests healthy by grazing on old grasses and shrubs so more water and sunlight could reach the soil. This is a wood bison, a type of American bison found only in northern Canada. They're known for their big hump of muscle, carried ahead of their front legs to support their heavy heads. They're also called a buffalo, after the French fur trappers called them buffs, which means ox. As he eats, he never stops moving his massive body so that he never overgrazes a particular area. He acts like a lawnmower, clearing out old plants. He stirs the soil with his hooves, spreading seeds as he kicks his legs through the meadow. He's also converting the grasses into nutrient-rich manure. Bison are North America's largest land animals, weighing in at 2,000 pounds. And they need a lot of grass to maintain this physique. The effect of a herd on the landscape is huge. Over 100 species of birds have evolved to thrive in the habitat left behind by grazing bison. The birds, such as these magpies, eat insects kicked up by the bison's hooves. And they also eat parasites and ticks that plague these bulky beasts. Before European settlers arrived in North America, there were up to 60 million bison ranging from Canada to northern Mexico. But then those settlers arrived and almost completely wiped the bison off the map. In 1890, only 1,000 bison remained across North America. The last bison in the northern Rockies was killed by a rancher in 1919. By 1957, bison were thought to be extinct in Canada. Once again, humans stepped in, this time as wildlife managers, with a plan to bring back the bison. Within decades, breeding programs in both Canada and the United States began to repopulate the herds. As bison numbers grew, they were transported around the world to re-establish a population. In the 1980s, the first bison was shipped out to the northern Rockies, where researchers felt they had an excellent chance of survival. Now, there are more than 1,000 bison living here in the safety of the grasslands, and 500,000 living across North America. Balance is key. The mix of old growth forests and new growth creates homes for many. Some species need the old growth forest, like the caribou. Caribou are the only member of the deer family where both males and females grow antlers. They're covered with hair from their nose to their toes. It insulates them, keeping them warm through the winters. They have an incredibly flexible diet and are the only large mammals that can live off lichen, a combination of fungus, algae, and bacteria that grows very well in the cold, dark north. That's the caribou survival strategy, to live in areas where other animals cannot. But even with these adaptations, they haven't been doing so well in a changing world.
Well, caribou in Alberta and across the boreal forest are declining, and in Alberta in particularly, there's declines of about 8% a year in a lot of these herds.
Caribou need large, untouched landscapes to survive. Over the past several decades, they have been retracting northwards, away from development and human encroachment. In several areas of the Rockies, caribou have disappeared completely. completely.
So because caribou need these large tracts of continuous old-growth forest with a lot of lichen on the ground to have healthy populations, so they don't have to, they don't overlap with where moose, deer and elk are, and so there's not a lot of predators within the ranges. If we have caribou in the landscape, it means we've got really good big patches of old-growth boreal forest, which is really what we want.
Unlike moose and elk, caribou prefer old-growth forests.
This is the type of forest that caribou do well in, because caribou can't deal with a lot of predators within their ranges. They only have one calf a year. They don't reproduce like moose, because you've probably seen moose with twins and triplets out there. Caribou don't do that. So they really need to be places where there aren't a lot of predators. And that means they need to be places where there aren't a lot of moose, deer and elk. Moose, deer and elk like a lot of green food. So that's why caribou end up doing best in forests like this.
There are very few roads up here, but there are seismic lines. Clear cuts through the forest, made in the 1980s when the energy industry searched for oil here.
The main focus of our research for the last few years has been looking at these seismic lines. So there's over 15,000 kilometers of them in west central Alberta. They were built in the 1980s, and a lot of them don't regenerate naturally because of the way that they were built. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand wildlife response to them. So not just caribou, but predators and also other ungulates. So caribou generally just avoid disturbance. They avoid seismic lines, they avoid roads, they avoid well sites. So if they can, if within their ranges there's places they can be that's far from human disturbance, then that's where they will be. But there's some areas within the boreal forest, and particularly in Alberta, where they can't be very far from human disturbance.
In this stretch of forest, it's hard to find a patch of woods that isn't bisected by these man-made disturbances. So the caribou end up crossing these lines. Laura's remote cameras capture the true biodiversity along these seismic lines. Moose and deer stroll through on their daily commute. And so do predators, like bears, wolves, and even the elusive lynx. The seismic lines have effectively become easy highways for predators, giving them access to regions they previously couldn't get to. That rarely ends well for the caribou.
Caribou try and live in places where wolves don't, and where they have low predation risk, because if they do encounter a wolf, then they have a high probability of mortality.
Caribou don't live in Banff National Park anymore, but in the past few years, researchers have been trying to determine if they should be brought back.
So we used to have maybe 25, maybe 40 caribou in Banff National Park in the late 1980s. And as wolves came back onto the landscape, the caribou declined. That's in part because elk were migrating up into caribou range, and the wolves would follow elk up into caribou range and then kill caribou while they're at it. The last 5 caribou in Banff were killed in an avalanche. And so now we're trying to determine, should we try and reintroduce caribou back to Banff National Park? I don't see anything yet.
To figure out if caribou could survive here, Jesse is studying the resident wolves in the park. Wolves thrive in old-growth forests because the massive trees and thick underbrush help them sneak up on their prey. But they can also be found among the new growth, most often because that's where their prey, like elk, prefer to be.
Wolves are these absolutely amazing animals. First, they're incredibly smart. They're so powerful. When you see a wolf in the wild, it's like, that is a wolf. It's moving with confidence. There's like this big spring in their steps as you see them moving along. And they work as a team. And when I think of wolves, I really think of wolves as travelers. They travel and they travel and they travel. Right now the wolves have denned, and they're traveling 15 to 20 kilometers away to kill, say, an elk or a deer. Then they haul that meat back to the den for the pups. And they just do that day in, day out.
Jesse uses GPS tracking and remote collars to watch the wolves from afar.
And these radio collars we put on the wolves last winter, 2 wolves from the Bow Valley pack, help us track their movements and understand how they're moving through the landscape. Yeah, I think the wolves are that way. Not too far away, maybe a kilometer away. Probably rolling back to the den, bringing food back to the den. They're probably tired this time of year.
Jesse also uses remote cameras, which give him a glimpse into the secret lives of Banff's wolf populations.
Remote cameras are really a godsend to wildlife research, and especially for us to be able to do non-invasive research and monitoring of our wildlife population. So we have remote cameras from Waterton through Jasper. Every 10 by 10 square kilometer grid cell, pretty much, we have a remote camera. Right now in Banff National Park, we have approximately 3 wolves per 1,000 square kilometers, and we think that's probably historically what wolf densities were before European settlers came, but we don't really know for sure. But that's not a lot of wolves. When you think that one wolf pack, say the Bow Valley pack, is 5 individuals, and their territory goes from Banff town site right up to Bow Summit, like that's an hour-long drive. That's one wolf pack territory. So one wolf pack has a territory between, often at least 1,000 square kilometers in the Rocky Mountains.
The GPS data collected from the collars showed that the wolves were gathering at a particular spot. Usually, that means they made a kill.
When I downloaded the wolf GPS points, it looks like they were here about 2 weeks ago. And I put them on my GPS, and our cluster of points is, just about 250 meters ahead. Okay, here's the meadow. Okay, it says I'm within about 15 meters. 10, close. Oh yeah, here we go. Looks like they killed something. What do we have? Oh, it's a pretty big jawbone. I'm guessing moose, especially with this long, dark, thick hair. Scapula. Oh, another jawbone. This is a younger one, I'm guessing.
The GPS data shows that the wolves spent 3 days here. If this was an adult moose, the carcass would have fed them for up to a week.
So, and they fit together. And my guess that this is a young of year moose. This with the really small teeth on the side and smaller jaw. It's so fascinating coming to these kill sites because you feel like a little bit of a detective. You can see the wolves killed the moose here just by these broken sticks. This is where the final struggle occurred. The wolves killed the moose. Then, as they typically do, they dragged the carcass out into more open areas where they'd have more space and could eat in the sunshine.
Since this kill happened at the end of winter, this moose likely didn't have much meat on its bones. So the wolves left nothing to waste, eating even the marrow from the young moose's femur.
This is definitely a wolf predation site as opposed to something killed by a cougar, grizzly bear, or coyote. The wolf jaws are so strong, they chew right through this pelvic girdle. They pulled the femur right out of the socket here and carried it away. And coyotes just aren't that strong. Grizzly bears are that strong, but this isn't a grizzly bear predation site because the carcass isn't buried. Grizzly bears would take all the vegetation from a long ways away and bury all the carcass. And it's not a cougar because cougars also bury their carcasses, but in a very, very neat fashion. So this is definitely wolf predation.
Wolves are master hunters. That's how they help balance the forest.
Wolves regulate the amount of prey in the ecosystem, so they regulate the number of elk, the number of deer, the number of moose. And those animals in turn regulate how much grass versus shrub versus trees we see on the landscape. So it's called top-down effects. So wolves have these top-down effects on the ecosystem. The wolves came back. We saw that the willows started growing back, aspen started regenerating, and we saw demonstrable effects of songbirds and beavers coming back into the system. So it really showed how everything is connected, and wolves are a big driver of what we see in the park.
By tracking the wolves, Jesse can see that while wolf numbers aren't necessarily high, they are spending a lot of time in potential caribou habitat. Which means that any herd that gets introduced in Banff likely wouldn't live for very long.
I think definitely there's places in the Canadian Rockies and throughout northern Canada where we can keep caribou on the landscape. I personally don't think it's Banff National Park, but we'll see down the road and see if conditions change.
This type of conservation work is all a part of keeping balance in the forest.
Forests are such integral parts of the ecosystem, and really what we're trying to do in national parks is replicate or emulate what was here before European settlers came. We want the forest to be able to evolve and adapt and change over time. So, our vision isn't a static forest state. It's something that's going to change over time that hopefully will replicate what was here before European settlement. The biggest challenge, and it's one I embrace, is just trying to figure out how we can minimize our effects on wildlife species. And just trying to see how can we do things so that people can come and enjoy the park, see wildlife, just experience this amazing landscape while still allowing wolves and grizzly bears and wolverine and cougar to thrive in this landscape.
The boreal and the montane forests are a crucial ecosystem for the wildlife of the Northern Rockies. The balance between old and new, lush and sparse, and predator and prey is important so that each species can have what it needs, whether they're big bison or shy caribou. Or elk feasting among the ashes. The forests are home to countless animals, and they need to be protected. Even if that means destroying them once in a while.
Every day we learn more about our forests, and every day we're making strides to make them healthier and stronger for time immemorial.